Hey, this is Joe from Presonus, and today I want to answer the question, what do the terms pre-fader and post-fader mean, and when would you use one over the other? The cool thing, let's open a new song while I talk about this. The cool thing about, just do a blank one. The cool thing about a lot of these ideas, pre-fader, post-fader, if you're trying to figure out how something works, usually, even if you don't memorize the definition, you can kind of test it out yourself to remind yourself. So I'm going to show you how I would do that. If I sat down and said, shoot, I can't remember what pre-fader and post-fader, which one is which, it's a pretty easy thing to diagnose. So let me record a very quick vocal. Yeah. Okay, so now we have our beautiful vocal. All right, so on this track, we're going to add a reverb using a send, right? The way to do that in Studio One, of course, is to use our good friend drag and drop. I'm going to drag in the flat plate preset because I like that one a lot. So I drag it into the send section. Studio One does the rest of the work for me. I hit play. Now I have reverb. Now, the part we're talking about today, this whole pre-fader and post-fader thing, has to do with, let's zoom way in, this little fella right here. So if you're not familiar with the way sends work in Studio One, this is the send. This power button lets me turn it on and off. So if I turn this off, we're no longer sending the vocal to the reverb, so it should sound dry. If I turn it on, we should now have reverb. And if I push this fader, this little horizontal fader up, we should have approximately 1 crap ton of reverb. Yes, perfect. Okay, so, and by the way, if you hold down Command and click on this on the Mac, I believe it's Control on the PC, it'll jump to 0. That is also true of our faders and panners, by the way. Command click, bam, it goes back to the default center and 0 position. Okay, so back to pre-fader send. What if you hover over this thing right here? It's actually a button, and we can see this turns pre-fader on or off. So by default, when we bring in a reverb, it is set up as what's called a post-fader send. If I click this, it is now a pre-fader send. So if you look at that, see how that image is toggling back and forth? This is pre-fader, meaning the send, which is represented by this little square. If we're going from left to right, then just as far as visually, then this goes to the reverb and then the signal hits the fader. If we flip it around, it hits the fader and then goes to the reverb. This is a common concept from like consoles, like physical analog consoles. Sometimes there would be a button to do pre or post fade, or you needed to know whether a particular aux send on a mixer was a pre-fader send or a post-fader send. Okay, so what does that mean? That means if I have this set to the default post-fader send, if I turn the vocal up and down, it is going to, that volume adjustment is going to be hitting the send as well. So the signal flow goes, sound comes into the channel, goes through the plugins, goes through the fader, then goes out the send. So if you're imagining like an actual physical connection, that physical connection is happening after the signal goes through the fader. So that means if I turn this fader down, we should also hear the reverb being turned down as well. Let's try it. So now if I play with the fader all the way down, we hear nothing. Now what happens if I click the little button and turn this into a pre-fader send? All right, I've clicked that. My fader is still down, but let's take a listen. Now we're hearing the reverb. Why? Because we've changed the order. We've just toggled the order to where this send is now happening. It's now actually happening more like what you would expect if you're looking at the signal flow from top to bottom. Signal comes in the top, goes through any plugins you have here, then it gets copied over to the send, then it goes through the fader. So that means the fader has 0 control over what's going to the send. Now, situations where that might be helpful is perhaps you do want just like an all reverb sound. You don't want any of the dry signal. You could do that by putting a reverb on the channel itself, but if for whatever reason you want to do it on a send, now we can control how much of the signal is going to the reverb simply by adjusting this level here. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. So stupid. Now you may think, okay, but weren't we adjusting the level of the reverb in post fader send? We were. So this is like kind of like a relative level. So like right now, here's the amount of reverb. And then let's say, oh, that's too much for this song. Let's do something a little more subtle. Okay, that's too subtle. Let's go split the difference. Okay, it's a nice subtle amount of reverb. Now, if I bring the vocal up or down, it's going to maintain that relative difference in volume, right? The reverb will still be that much quieter than the vocal, but as I turn the vocal down, the reverb is also getting turned down. Here we go. Oh, yeah. So it's commensurate. Is that the right word? The amount of reverb stays the same relative to the fader here, essentially. So we can adjust that difference here. How much reverb do we have relative to the fader? But then when we adjust the fader, the reverb doesn't stay the same. So a natural place where this could maybe come back to bite you, and I use post-fader send, I'd say probably 98% of the time. But if we had a post-fader send on this vocal, for example. Oh, yeah. And then later on we decided, you know what, that vocal needs to, we need to turn that down. Well, what would happen is we'd turn the vocal down, but the reverb would still stay up. Vocal, vocal, vocal. See the problem? The reverb isn't moving with us, it's moving independently. And so that's why for stuff like this, for send effects like this, I tend to want to use a post fader send, which is the default way that works. But let's say, for example, that this, instead of being a vocal, is something like a drum beat. That's so good. And let's say we wanted to take this amazing drum beat and we wanted to do what we call in the biz parallel processing. So let's say we wanted to run this to a compressor on another channel and have the dry signal not be compressed and then combine that with a compressed signal. Well, there's lots of ways to do that in Studio One, but if that's kind of the workflow you like to have a separate fader for each, you could do something like this. So let's grab our compressor plugin and let's just set it to something obnoxious just so we can hear that it's working. That's great. Okay, so now this is still adjusting how much we're sending to that compressor, and it is relative to this fader. In this situation, I don't really want it to be, I don't want adjustments to this fader to adjust what's hitting that compressor. I'd rather it hit it at a consistent volume. So I would turn the pre-fader on in this instance, and then I've got them independent of one another. So if I turn this one all the way down, it's just so beautiful. Or to maybe make it a little more obvious, we could put something like red light distortion on here. And then and if we wanted to blend between the two, it's essentially more or less, it's exactly the same as if we just duplicated this track entirely, like right click, duplicate track complete. It's the same thing as if we did this and put the red light distortion on this channel. It's the same basic idea, except we don't have to have the extra audio track in our arranger. So we have the same net result of having a dry version of the vocal and then a compressed version, or I guess in this instance, a distorted version of the vocal. And if we use a pre-fader send, we can adjust how much is going to that distortion, and then we still have this fader over here to adjust the balance between the two. That's just an amazing drum part. So those are the basic differences between pre and post fader. Pre-fader is, for me personally, just in those occasional situations where I need this to send no matter what. Side chaining is another example where, let's say I want to side chain a kick drum sound to trigger a synth, but I don't want to hear the kick at all. I just want that sound to be triggering the gate on the synth or the side chain compression. You'll notice if we do something like that, let's say I let's go back to compressor on this one. And let's say I wanted to side chain it off of the vocal using a send. You'll note it created that for us over here. And then we can decide if we want that to be pre-fader or not. So then we can decide if we want to hear the kick drum, great. If we want it to trigger it and not hear it, we could do something like this and turn the fader all the way down, and now the kick drum is only being heard by this compressor. That gets a little more advanced, but if you're doing sidechaining already, you probably already knew that. One other thing that will, I'm sure this question will come up. It's the idea of pre and post fader metering. So if you right-click on the volume meters here in the mixer, one of the options you have is pre-fader metering. So let me show you what that is. Let's loop our beautiful... Okay, so right now, if I were to hit play on this vocal, I just turn the volume down so you don't hear it. We can see a meter here, right? And if I turn this down, we'll see the meter go down with it. You see that? The meter went down as I turned down. So the meter is showing me the volume that's happening after the fader. If I right-click on this, I can select pre-fader metering, and then if I hit play and I pull the volume all the way down, stop that. Sorry. I'm just totally driving myself crazy. Now, if I pull this volume all the way down, we still see that there's a signal there. It's really a personal preference thing. The default mode, I believe, is post-fader metering. I sometimes like pre-fader, so if I have a bunch of tracks and I've got all the faders turned down because I'm just getting started mixing, sometimes it's nice to see that, oh, there's a signal under that fader, and I can see that if I've got pre-fader metering on. So I can see that there's some signal happening here, even though I can't hear it, and that kind of gives me a mental reminder to turn this up. To me, that's more useful, especially in mixing, but there are situations where honestly, by default, I think it's post-fader by default. So that's probably the mode you're currently using. But that's something you can look into and switch at your leisure. Now, I believe it's a global thing, so it applies across all faders. So you can't like do one on one fader and one on the other. But if you really decide that pre-fader is what you want, you could just set that up as kind of the default mode in one of your templates, and then you'll always have that set up. All right, so those are the differences between pre-fader and post-fader. Hope that was helpful for you. As always, thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.